Hey, my name is Chris, and this is Code Next Door. Today we're going to talk about how requests are processed in Phoenix. So we start at our web application. We're at localhost 4000. We refresh. We just gave a GET request to our server, and magically, happened within a couple milliseconds, we get back the HTML, the CSS, and the JavaScript needed to make all this work nicely. But how does that work? So if we go to the code, everything starts with the endpoint. So if we look at our server and look at what happens when we first start our server, you'll see that after we run IEX-s mix Phoenix server, the first thing that we see in the info is that we're running the endpoint with Cowboy, and Cowboy is like the web server underneath the hood. And then it's saying we're accessing this endpoint at our IP address. So if we look at the contents of our endpoint, we'll see that we're using the Phoenix endpoint and defining some things about our application, defining a module doc for the session options, and then we define the socket thing here. And this sets up sockets for Phoenix Live View, but we're just talking about Phoenix today, so we'll go a bit more general here. So Phoenix, it all operates off of a notion of a plug. And a plug you can think of as a function that is just processing the connection of the web request. So we receive a web request, we start at the static plug. So that's how all the static files get processed and sent to the server. So anything in priv static is going to get served at the root. So that's how you get your images and some of your assets served. It's through this plug here. So first the request is checking to see, oh, we need to return all of the static assets. So then if we look at the man-in-flow web static paths here, that's going to show where all our static assets are. And then you'll see here, if you're in developer mode, like if you want the code reloading on, or you're in dev mode, then you do all this nice stuff here. So we have Phoenix Live View reloaders, code reloaders, and then that nice check for Ecto that lets you do the migration check status. And then after you go through all that, we have live dashboard stuff that does request logging, some telemetry stuff here, and some parsers for JSON and JSON. And then at the very end, we see that we plug the session. So if we're dealing with users, we need this plug. And then lastly, we have our router. So the request goes through all these different things, and these functions are manipulating the connection, and then we serve it to our router. So if I open up the router file on the right, so essentially, we're just plugging into this router. And you'll notice that in our router file, we have these pipelines. So pipelines is just like an extension of this whole plug notion, except it allows you to create different pipelines for different types of requests. So if you had a browser request, like if you're accepting HTML requests, then you want to use the browser pipeline. But if you're accepting JSON, then you want to use the API pipeline. So our router is processing the request, and we use a bunch of macros to kind of determine how that request ends up getting processed. So if it's accepting an HTML, if that request is accepting HTML, then we're going to pipe it through the browser. So it's going to be one of the browser things that could pipe through. And if that request fits the scope, which is the root scope, then we're going to follow this. And within that scope, well, this is where we define what actually happens. So we're saying that if we're at the root scope and there's nothing in our path, then we want to direct this request to this page controller. So if I open up the controllers file and go to the page controller, we'll see that the page controller has a function defined home, and and this matches the home here. And then this page controller is taking a con. That's just the connection. Uh, and that's the same con that's been passed from the endpoint through all those plugs. So it has the session information and the request logging, all that jazz. But then the controller's like, okay, take this con and I'm going to render it, and I'm not going to use layout. And it renders based off of some file location stuff. So if we look in page HTML, we'll see that we see a home HTML hex file, and then this is file everything finally gets rendered. So let's just go back through how we started to recap. So we started at the endpoint. So we go through this with the connection, and we go through all these different plugs, the plug static to get our static files, the code reloading if you're in like developer mode, the telemetry, the parsing. Then we hit our router, and then the router has to determine which scope this falls under, and then it goes through the pipeline, and those are just a bunch of plugs that manipulate the connection. And then finally, we actually will direct the request to the particular controller or the live view that it makes sense to send it to. So that is sort of the life cycle of the web requests or the con. I hope this video was helpful for anyone that watched it, and I hope to see you in the next one. Talk to you later.